Recording started. Hey there, folks. IU Insider Zach Osterman, Indianapolis Star. This is Mind Your Banners for Monday, September 30th, 2024. He's Mike Niziolek across the screen, as you can see there from the Bloomington Herald Times. Don't usually do these on Mondays, but with a bit of a crowded week this week, men's and women's basketball media days up in suburban Chicago, out near O'Hare in the Big Ten headquarters midweek, and then obviously Indiana at Northwestern, a very sort of a Windy City week, if you will, for IU athletics. Ahead, we figured we'd go ahead and recap and just kind of put to bed IU 42, Maryland 28. And Mike, I actually listened to our season preview podcast yesterday just to kind of set the stage, at least in my own mind, for this one, because I wanted the theme of this, if these podcasts have themes other than the two of us making fun of each other, to be something that you talked about after on our sort of, immediate reaction post-game podcast Saturday, which is resetting expectations. I don't think either you or I are surprised to see Indiana as a potential bowl team. We both picked them to finish with a winning record. We both picked them to go to a bowl game. I don't think anyone saw this coming, and not just 5-0 in the sense that you could have talked yourself into Indiana winning any of these first 3 games, or first 5 games rather. But 5-0 the way they've done it, they have one of the most explosive offenses in the country. They have an incredibly disruptive defense. They have not trailed for a single snap this year. Saturday was actually the first time they were even tied in the second half of a game, if I'm not mistaken. And so I just kind of wanted to dig a little deeper into this question of resetting expectations. And we'll talk a little bit, obviously, about Northwestern, but what you do or how you evaluate Indiana going forward now, given what you have seen them accomplish so far this season. I recognize that's a bit of an open-ended mandate, but that's kind of what I'm spitting at you to start with here.
Well, yeah, I think that I think if we looked at that first block before the season and kind of what I thought is 4-1 at a minimum, 5-0 if everything broke right in terms of that first, what kind of challenge would UCLA present? What kind of challenge would Maryland? Maryland is obviously the bigger challenge. They go undefeated. I think the difference and what you kind of said about us sort of, and I think the rest of the fan base not kind of believing that they would steamroll the competition to such an extent where
they'd be this dominant, essentially.
A 513 yards per game, ranked 9th in the country. Scoring offense, 3rd in the country, 48.8 points per game. Only Tennessee and Miami and they're tied with Ohio State, actually. So, I mean, in elite company in terms of offensive efficiency, offensive production. And you kind of wondered, I think, when you got to those Power 5 games or Power 4 games now, how some of those transfers, because the bulk of their transfers, especially on the defensive side, were guys that were not at the Power 4, Power 5 level last year. And that has not been a question at all. I mean, really, you've seen, literally everybody they've relied on, has been successful. I think the biggest guy, the slowest guy to sort of acclimate to Cignetti's system is a CJ West, who was one of the most high-profile transfers in the spring and maybe altogether in terms of like how sought after he was. And, they didn't face any adversity through the first 4 games. And then, you mentioned this game being tied in the second half. And I thought Cignetti's point today was interesting, is that he felt that this game could have been probably a lot more lopsided in the end if they had cleaned up a couple things in that second half, that he wanted them to have really made a statement late. And, they could have hit 50. And so I don't know if you watched Mike Loxley's post-game press conference, but he said, because somebody asked us, like, why did you punt? There was a minute left. I mean, the chances of winning are very slim, but still a 2-possession game. You have the ball. Why'd you punt? And he's like, look, I don't really talk about playmaking, play decisions like that, but essentially I was waving the white flag that I didn't want to get my guys hurt. And then, so you talk about imposing your will, and that's not a spot Indiana's been in. I mean, historically, you could speak to that.
Do you think he punted? Do you think Cignetti took a knee? When Cignetti has been like an admittedly kind of
As like a tip of the cap for saying you've waived the right.
You were willing to punt and kind of let this thing go. So I know I'm in the shadow of your goal line here, but I'm going to just take a knee. We're all going to shake hands and move on.
I think if they had tried to go for it, maybe that he would have tried to score. But he was like, since you've obviously called off the troops, so the ceasefire is accepted.
Right. Yes, the armistice has arrived. All the guns are signed.
The Indiana-Maryland Treaty of 2024. But I think style points, and for a team that's really struggled against FCS competition, struggled to beat teams that they should have. I mean, style points matters because Cignetti's talked about trying to win over hearts and minds, and I think he's done that through 5 weeks more so than anybody kind of anticipated.
Some of this stuff, you're torn on a little bit of it because, defensively, their numbers are good. They're top 10 in the nation in total defense. They are 13th in the country in points allowed per game. They are, I'm just looking at these numbers on CFB stats, they're 5th in the nation in sacks. They're in, I think, the top 15 or the top 20, somewhere in that range in tackles for loss. The offensive numbers are dominant. And, for a while we said, okay, but some of that is the Western Illinois effect. They had so many yards and so many points, and that game was so dominant. But at a certain point, we have to stop holding that against them when they put up 42 in each of their first 2 Big Ten games. And the only game they didn't at least reach 40. The only game they didn't reach at least 42 was their week 1 win, which they still won by 24 points and covered. And, you look at, even the efficiency stuff, they're first in the nation in touchdowns. Indiana scored more touchdowns than anyone else in the country. They are, I think, top 5 in third down conversions. We've talked about their red zone efficiency. And I guess what happens Saturday that I think is meaningful to people, or meaningful maybe to at least some sort of, objective evaluation of the season so far, is it was hard for the first time. The opponent could kind of put up a fight. And obviously that UCLA game, continues to kind of lose value the more we see UCLA play football. But Maryland's a team that's won 3 straight bowl games. I suspect they will be back there again, or at least very close to it this year. They've got athletes, they've got guys comfortable in the system, et cetera. And it's just sort of at what point do we stop holding it against Indiana, who they've played, when they've been beating them the way they've been beating them? And you touch on it there. Just, we expected that maybe Indiana could get a 4-1, or if they really kind of locked in, even a 5-0 start. But the fact that Indiana through 5 weeks has not even trailed yet is just not something that I think anyone could have foreseen, and anyone could have, imagined this team was capable of. When you considered, you talk about, the number of transfers that have kind of moved up and performed well. Kel Kamara, Elijah Surratt, Curtis Rourke, all the running backs, whatever. I would also just say generally, a team that has managed to navigate so much roster turnover as well as Indiana has, I think that's got to be a consideration too.
Well, I think that part, I will say, not to interrupt you, but having that core group from JMU, I think, negates some of that. That the core of this defense did play together last year, and I think that maybe we underestimated that. Look, all the changeover was more so for the guys, the IU players that were returning. They were sort of the outsiders in the starting lineup, especially on the defensive side of the ball. I think it's a little separate, offense a little different, but in terms of the defense, I think having so many guys there that played together last year almost made it like this was like JMU. This was JMU's defense. The core part of their success, and the guys talked about it on Saturday, that this is essentially how JMU won on defense last year. They attacked the quarterback, they got vertically upfield, and they did what they did to Billy Edwards, and that was what it looked like. And so I think that has made more of a difference in terms of having the chemistry right off the bat, being more successful than there was sort of last year when the last 2 years when Indiana had all those transfers, everything just looked disjointed.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that recommends the players that we're talking about. In terms of like the individuals, Elijah Surratt or Mikel Kamara, who's been so important. I think it also, and I don't know if this like should go without saying, but I mean, we looked at this, to be fair, we looked at this coaching staff and we said like so many of these guys have been successful with Curt Cignetti and they deserve credit for that, but they have not had to deal with a Big Ten schedule or Big Ten expectations or, Power 5, I guess we call it now, Power 4 football. I think that also recommends the staff, both in terms of what they've been able to do since they've gotten to Indiana, but also the quality of the players they're bringing with them. Because at the end of the day, I know you asked, others asked, Mikel Kamara, for example, about not getting offered by Maryland. He grew up in that area. I think he wanted the Maryland offer. It didn't come. There was a little bit kind of a revenge game there. But the point is, like, that's what a lot of these guys were. Elijah Surratt was, I think, an FCS or a Division II player that transferred up to James Madison last year. Aiden Fisher was a guy I know. I talked to somebody, a friend of mine who lives out in the Fredericksburg area. Fisher was a really good prospect that probably just didn't get noticed enough because of COVID. And he was a little bit undersized. And you can go.
James Carpenter was a walk-on.
Yeah, you can go player by player on why these guys wound up where they were. But the point is, it's not just the staff having success in terms of taking a player and putting them in a position to succeed. It's also like this is the quality of the player development they've been putting in the last 2, 3, 4 years. This is the quality of the players that they were winning with. And I guess probably even to some extent, I don't want to just drill deeper and deeper into this, but probably even to some extent, frankly, a bit of an element of like who Curt Cignetti brought with him and who he didn't. I mean, and I'm not picking on Jordan McLeod, who's been really, really good for Texas State. But for example, we all just kind of assumed, Curt Cignetti coached the Sun Belt Offensive Player of the Year at quarterback last year, and he's in the portal. He'll probably come to Indiana. I don't think Indiana ever very seriously considered recruiting Jordan McLeod. They went for something else. They were looking for something else, something, if not better, then at least different. And that's what they got in Curtis Rook. My point is, it's just kind of, you sort of like, I think I have to appreciate that part of resetting expectations, to come back to that theme around Indiana, is maybe appreciating the extent to which this staff was even better than what we thought when it was put together.
Well, particularly on the offensive side, continuity, we'll see what down the line if he's able to maintain that with kind of the interest probably coming up here in the next 6 months. But that continuity, I think, makes a difference, and that you don't see it very often now in college football. And maintaining a staff for so long, that this is sort of the fruits. That this is the fruit. The success is a fruit of that. And so, you have Tino Sansari, you have Mike Shanahan, guys that he can trust and lean on. And he didn't and I think he said this in a previous press conference, that he didn't have to sort of reset things when he got here, but he could just hit the ground running in terms of his coaching staff. You just incorporate a Bob Bostad and a couple of the defensive guys, but then you just kind of go. Like, you don't have to worry about that part of it. And that sort of gave him a head start on things when taking over, because he didn't have to be like, look, here's how I approach things. Here is my blueprint. Everybody knew his blueprint, and the few guys that didn't could be brought along. But in terms of your question, kind of, sort of skipping Northwestern a little bit, just in terms of, I think we both expect them to win and win handily. You look at that back half, that final 6 games. Do you go by win number? Like, is anything less than 4-2 would be now disappointing? Like, what's your sort of expectation? What do you think the fans' expectation is for that the second half of the season coming out of the bye?
I'll be honest. I something in my gut says Indiana has some trouble this weekend. I think they'll win. It was pointed out to me Indiana's not won at Northwestern in 31 years, which surprised me because I've covered some competitive games up there. But, I saw that and I thought, no way. And then I kind of thought about it. I was like, never actually seen a win. I've seen them lose a bunch of close games, but I've never seen Indiana win at Northwestern. I also just get nervous anytime it's a road game against a team that obviously they have offensive problems, but I think they've got a strong defensive identity. It feels like they'll at least kind of be able to muck that game up a little bit.
It's just hard when you don't have any kind of quarterback.
they don't score. I mean, they can't move the ball and they can't score the ball. And that, like, it is hard to imagine. It's not hard for me to imagine Indiana kind of getting dragged into it for a while. And maybe it's the fourth quarter and it's only like a 7-point game, 9-point game, something like that. It's hard for me to imagine a team averaging almost 49 points per game not being able to outscore a team that I think got 5 2 weeks ago against Washington. Like, you know, and I'm not trying to be flippant, but, like, you know, you're right. They have.
Well, Northwestern, just in terms of numbers, has scored 7 touchdowns all season. Ranked number 122 in scoring, 17.3 points per game. And
the only Big Ten team scoring fewer points per game is UCLA.
And total offense, only one of, I think, 14 teams averaging less than 300 yards per game. So, I mean, pretty ugly. That Washington game, they only had 112 yards total on 53 plays.
Yeah. I mean, they're the only team, and obviously this is a team-wide statistic, and I know quarterback rating is a little controversial for people. They're the only team with a team quarterback rating under 100 in the Big Ten. Like, that's very bad. But again, I feel like you can. I feel like if you are Indiana, I mean, this is the kind of game where you need some sharpness early to make sure that you don't. I mean, because you got away with some mistakes, you played your way past some mistakes against Maryland. You deserve credit for that. I suspect you could get punished on a different day. Certainly on the road, you might get punished for those a little bit more. And I wouldn't be shocked if this game isn't just like a 41-10 kind of cakewalk. I wouldn't be shocked if Indiana's, kind of got to fight for it a little bit here, as opposed to, there have been times in the last couple of weeks where it's almost looked like Indiana was playing with its food. I mean, even Maryland, that game is tied 21 apiece at one point in the third quarter, and you still kind of feel like Indiana's just kind of dangling it out there a little bit. But Indiana should win this game. And then, I don't know if you can. The back half of the schedule is tougher, and we always knew it would be tougher. Ohio State and Michigan are there, but Michigan State might have something about them. Washington and Nebraska. Indiana, I think right now and through Northwestern, let's assume Indiana does manage to beat Northwestern no matter what the cost on Saturday, then I think you're in a situation where Indiana might have played one bowl team through its first 6 games. And I think there could be as many as 4 or, depending upon how Washington pulls some things together against a tough schedule, maybe even 5. In the back half, I think Purdue is the only team right now I would just look at and say flatly, not going to make a bowl. Washington, I think, has got a tough road.
Washington, Michigan, Ohio, Iowa, at Indiana, USC, Penn State, UCLA is their other bye week, and then Oregon.
Yeah. No, Washington has a tough road.
That's right.
I think they're more competitive than the teams Indiana's been playing, is my point.
Yeah, but the bowl measure might not be the best one, because that's going to be
that's where I come back to, I don't know if I can put a win total on it, because it just feels like the competition is going to get stiffer. But I think it certainly, I think at minimum, if we're talking about resetting expectations and we're trying to quantify it for people, it's hard to look at this team's remaining schedule and feel like it shouldn't win at least 8 games. And I think that would require some regression, maybe an injury or 2. I think 9 is a firm possibility. I think you do start to get into you do start to get a little bit into fantasy land when you start talking about winning 10 regular season games. No matter how good Indiana is, I'm sorry, this program has never won 10 games in a season. You kind of have to see it to believe it. But I know a number of our listeners will probably be familiar with Punt John Punt, which is a long-standing IU football-focused Twitter account that in particular looks into a lot of analytics and things like that. And one of the things PJP does weekly during the season is take Bill Connolly's S&P Plus rankings and build a statistical probability graph of what the record will be. And right now, Punt John Punt tweeted this out yesterday. Indiana's got a 0% chance of going 5-7, 2% chance 6-6, 9% 7-5, The big cluster is 24% 8-4, 33% 9-3. So that's the likeliest record statistically speaking. 24% chance 10-2, 7% 11-1, and 1% 12-0. So Indiana actually has a according to Connolly's projections, a higher statistical chance of going 12-0 than it does 5-7. To me, I think you're looking, if you do want to put a number on it, at that 8 or 9 range, but I don't think 10's out of the question. And this is just talking about bowl games. Like I don't want to start projecting bowl games because you don't know who you're going to play. You don't know who's going to opt out. Different bowl games will mean different things for different guys. But just in the regular season, I think 8, 9 is probably still, to my mind, the safe, likely range. But I mean, 10 is becoming a lot less fanciful pretty much by the week.
Yeah, I mean, look, we could be in a week talking about they've already qualified. They're already bowl eligible, and I mean that's pretty impressive considering the history here and or lack their history of the postseason play. And so you kind of look at the second half. I think Cignetti would be disappointed with anything less than 9 wins if you're 6-0 at the start, right? Going under 500 for a stretch. Just based on kind of how he talks and things like that. I don't know what fans will say, to that. I mean, I think they've got to kind of be happy with where they're at and happy regardless of if it's 8, 9, or 10. But like you said, I feel like we're getting to the point where it's not inconceivable that Indiana is playing at Memorial Stadium in November against Michigan as an undefeated team.
No, I don't think that's, I mean, and like the one thing I would say in general, because I had somebody yesterday say, like, do you think Curt Cignetti could leave for a bigger job after this year? And it's obviously too early to speculate on that stuff. Like, jobs aren't even coming open yet. I think people forget Indiana's going to have Big Ten money if it needs to sweeten the deal for Cignetti, if it wants to, whatever. But just like more generally, like I think what I would tell IU football fans right now is just enjoy this. Like you don't get this very often. This is the third 5-0 start in program history. The average IU football fan wasn't alive for the first 2. I know some people will at least have vague memories of 1967, but the point is this just does not happen very often. So like to a certain extent, just enjoy this and worry about kind of what comes next, when it comes next, so to speak. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about like individual performers. I think one thing I know you and I have remarked on in different ways, but that has been striking to me is just how balanced Indiana's been offensively. Those 4 transfer running backs have somewhere between 130 and 341 yards. None of them are averaging fewer than 4.8 yards per carry. They've all scored at least 1 touchdown. 3 of them have at least 4. Indiana's got 4 receivers with at least 184 yards receiving. Again, if you want to talk about efficiency and that kind of stuff, all 4 of those receivers are averaging at least 14 yards per catch, which is obviously a really good number. Curtis Rourke has been, good kind of in all phases this year. I know he had the turnovers against Maryland, but he still threw for 359 and 3 scores. He's got 11 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. His numbers, whether you look at yards, attempts, average, touchdowns, completion percentage, whatever, stack up pretty well next to basically anybody else in the Big Ten. Like, a couple weeks ago, for those who don't watch the Curt Cignetti press conferences, somebody asked Curt Cignetti about Mike Shanahan's play calling, and Cignetti said playfully, though I think maybe not like
no, totally
without like some seriousness behind it. He said, well, it's my offense, right? And I know you talked about, and I talked about through the course of the offseason, Cignetti's success with transfer quarterbacks, as it related to Curtis Rourke. But I think we both maybe even underestimated just how functional the offense is, not necessarily like regardless of who's in it, but more the idea that it does not have to lean on any one thing. It is versatile enough to make a lot of different guys potential playmakers. And when you sit down and start to try and evaluate, like, what do you do with this offense if you're game planning for it? I don't quite know where you start. And you don't want to see Curtis Rourke commit 3 turnovers in a game, but there's also probably got to be something a little bit dispiriting if you're an opposing defensive coordinator and you finally see Rourke make some mistakes and he still throws for 359 and 3 scores, and Indiana wins by 2 touchdowns, scoring 42 points. Like, I just kind of don't know where you start with this team, with this offense specifically.
Well, Loxley mentioned that in terms of like, look, we won the turnover battle 4-0. You don't lose a lot of games like that. That's not good. But in terms of Rourke, I think a couple things. I think his body of work in terms of just the amount of experience he had helped counter sort of the jump in talent level that he's faced. Because I think Cignetti's kind of fallen back on that quite a few times, is that, look, we've not been worried about him. We know how he was going to react because he's just been through all these different situations. He's run a 2-minute offense a bunch of times. He's faced all these things. He's turned it over. He's had bad games, not a ton, but he's had bad games. So he kind of had that in the back of his head that, look, I don't have to get rattled. And so I think that's helped. And I think, look, not to sort of, I guess you can, but having a good quarterback coach, I think, makes a difference. And I think you could see.
How much do you think it makes a difference? Because Cignetti said something interesting a couple weeks ago. Somebody asked him about Tino Sunseri and Mike Shanahan. And he talked about the value of having Sunseri to coach the quarterback so Shanahan didn't have to. So that because in most places the offensive coordinator is also the quarterback's coach. And that can always be a little tricky in the sense that the quarterback's coach kind of maybe needs to be the most intensive of the offensive position coaches because your quarterback is the most important position. But then if that person's also the coordinator, they need to be worried about the most important position in the offense and then the offense more generally. Cignetti said having Sunseri and the way that he and Shanahan work together really helps because Shanahan can worry about the offense without having to worry about the quality of quarterback coaching.
That might be an added benefit, but I just meant in general, whether it's the offensive coordinator or it's just a quarterback's coach, having somebody that knows how to coach quarterbacks and develop them and keep them on task and keep them consistent. Consistency, I think, is something that you saw just was completely lacking last year on this offense in general, but from the quarterback specifically, that they could just never get in a rhythm and that they struggled. And so I think that you've seen sort of the benefit of having a guy that's just a really good Cignetti probably doesn't want us talking about this because there are going to be teams looking at him next year. But having that guy in that room that gets the best out of guys. And I think that when you're talking about the most important position in all of college football and all of sports, really, in terms of the quarterback, having the right guy, and Cignetti gets credit to it because he's the guy evaluating the talent. He found him. He thought he had a promising future, and he's kind of empowered him. And I think that's made a difference here.
I think some credit also should go to at least, again, through 5 games. I mean, Indiana's probably, again, I would say probably played one bowl team at this point, but some credit probably should also go to the only assistant coach that Indiana retained. I mean, Bob Bostad has done a really good job. He got dealt, if you're talking about offseason injuries and things, he got dealt probably the toughest blow in terms of losses in the offseason. Nick Kidwell goes down. Kidwell was, kind of a stalwart for Cignetti at James Madison. He was expected to be one of those interior spots, starting, playing pretty consistently for this offensive line. But I mean, Bostad retained probably 2 of his 3 most important linemen from last year. He found himself a new right tackle in the portal, and that line is, that was the first time Saturday was the first time Curtis Rourke had been sacked since week 1. We talk about the explosiveness, but there's also the efficiency of the offense. I mean, it's hard because you don't just want to sit here and just act like it's all sunshine and roses, but you also can't just artificially create reasons to criticize a team that is playing as well as Indiana is. They're even on a day when they show a bunch of vulnerability against Maryland, they still score 42 and they win.
The team's given up 27. This is according to Pro Football Focus. 26 quarterback pressures allowed, but only I think 15 or 16 of those are on the offensive line. Running backs, backup linemen have been credited with the others. Carter Smith has only allowed 1 pressure. I think his step forward. He's kind kind of really good pass blocking grade, 84.8. I think his step forward has been the most sort of significant or vast. Then he's just been times dominant, I think, on that left side, and that sort of helped. Some of the pre-snap penalties that you saw early have kind of been eliminated, and just a really effective group that had two new starters, two guys in Drew Evans and Bray Lynch that hadn't played a lot of football. I don't think Lynch really had played any snaps except.
I don't think he had, no.
So I mean, two new starters when you expected to have, their veteran most guy in terms of games played is not even part of the team right now. Season-ending injuries. So, really impressive group, and and been effective in both both the run game and the pass game. There's been no sort of weakness there.
I think defensively, I know Mikael Kamara is your guy. I think he's everybody's guy when we get him in front of the media and we realize he's the most quotable person on the team.
Yeah, you made fun of me about requesting him and saying we need to get him after that Maryland game. Did he disappoint?
No, he didn't. We talked about barbecue. It was fantastic. I think I invited him over so that I can make something tasty on the pit boss. But I mean, the ones I really can't get past are the linebackers. Fisher and Walker are so consistent, and I do not think, like, number one, I know we both thought that if Indiana was going to be kind of a pressure team this year, if they were going to, create a bunch of havoc plays and things like that, it was going to have to be with some creative blitzes and getting some stuff from the second level. And it's not like they haven't done that, but most of their production in the pass rush and against the run, in stuffs and things like that, has come from that front four. And it's allowed Fisher to just kind of almost act as a screen at the second level. I mean, he reminds me, he's not the same body type. He doesn't play the position the same way, but it kind of reminds me of Micah McFadden when he was here a few years ago, where it's just like you look up and he's always around the football. Like he's just, it gets past the line of scrimmage and there's number 4. And then Walker, like, I don't know if people appreciate how much they move Jalen Walker around, but like he covers slot receivers fairly consistently. Once or twice against Florida International, they had him at the boundary, or at least that's what it looked like. He's incredibly athletic for his position. You'd probably look at them both and feel like they're a little bit undersized, and maybe that'll come back to, maybe that'll be a little bit more difficult for Indiana when they play a Nebraska or when they play a Michigan or when they play an Ohio State. But listen, again, we're talking about resetting expectations for this program, or at least this team this season. You don't have to beat Ohio State for this to be a successful year. What you have to do is finish up, beat Northwestern, beat Washington, beat Purdue, maybe beat Nebraska, and then you're 9-3, and it's one of the 3 best seasons in program history, bar none. So I just like I keep coming back to wanting to find things to say about Indiana, to say like, hey, listen, somebody asked me on a radio interview today, like, what are 2 or 3 things Indiana can still clean up? And I was like, I mean, obviously don't turn it over, but they turned it over 4 times on Saturday, and they allowed 0 first downs off those 4 turnovers. So I can't even criticize that much. And you look around at these individual performers, we talked about the offensive side, but I even go to the defensive side. Sean Asbury's really stepped up, I think, at safety. D'Angelo Pons maybe has not been quite as noticeable as you would have thought, given his reputation from James Madison. But sometimes it doesn't hurt to have a corner that you don't notice very often because teams just aren't throwing his way. I mean, that defense, it obviously leans on some James Madison guys. But again, you just feel like everybody has been put in a really good position to succeed.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think the Maryland game was interesting because it was the first time they really shortened their rotation just like altogether. That they really didn't go to many 3 linebacker sets. It was Fisher and Walker, and then the 4 guys up front. I don't know if you saw the article I posted on Sunday. All played season high in snaps. Both the tackles, both the ends, everybody did. They just rarely came, I think Kamara and Carr both played 76 snaps out of the 78. So you can kind of see that they leaned on those guys, and the consistent pressure they got late in the game, still having played that amount, was impressive to me. I mean, talk about Kamara, 20 quarterback pressures. That's tied for 5th in the FBS, according to Pro Football Focus. 19.3% win rate. I mean, that's a dominant level, and so that, I mean, I know the linebackers have been good, but that just stands out to me in terms of I think in this game right now, we've talked about how important quarterbacks are. On the flip side, with defense, if you have a dominant edge rusher, it's so important. It changes the game and it makes it so much easier. And Kamara's been that. And what have they had a dominant edge rusher during your tenure covering the team?
Sorry, it took a second to get back to the mute button. We've talked about this. They have not had a double-digit sack guy.
Oh, just in terms of kind of alter sacks separate.
I mean, Mangieri was good. I wouldn't call him dominant. He was very productive. If Nick's listening, if he hears that, he's gonna find me because I think he lives in Chicago, so he might find me on Saturday. And even though he's not at his playing weight anymore, I've seen him, and he'd still crush my head between his hands. I mean, like in fits and starts, yes. So Mangieri had a couple pretty good seasons. To someone this disruptive, like consistently disruptive, because and again, it's hard because sack numbers just in general have gone down in the last 10 to 15 years.
Well, I've looked at the quarterback pressure numbers is kind of the numbers I was looking at on Pro Football.
Pressures and hurries and hits are as important.
They don't have anybody like over like 30, 35 last since Pro Football Focus has been in existence. So and Kamara's almost at going to get that in like 7-8 games. So he's at a number other especially with a 20% win rate. You guys have not had that. And I'm just if somebody that impacted the game like that you've seen, just they haven't had it, right?
No, they really haven't. I mean, like you'd have to go back in terms of that kind of production. I don't know how far back Pro Football Focus goes. Like Jamie Curlew had maybe an 11 sack, 12 sack season in 2008. The year before that, Greg Middleton had 17 and a half. And that was maybe the last time it felt quite like this, in the sense that team had a bunch of really good ball hawking defensive backs. And so Middleton and Curlew was on the other side. He just wasn't as productive that year. He had a much better year the next year. So the point was they had two good pass rushers that were just constantly forcing quarterbacks to make bad throws. So you kind of felt it. Like it wasn't just an individual sort of performance thing. It was also like you could see it in the way that games were playing out. But I mean, in terms of someone that changes the calculus for everyone else on the defensive line, the way that he does, the way that Kamara does, in the sense that, like, I think you can trace the success of James Carpenter or of Linnell Carr to some extent back to the way offensive lines have to pay attention to Kamara. I don't think they've had someone who's at least had this start. Now, again, let's see what happens when he starts facing, the Nebraskas, the Michigans, the Ohio States, where he's probably facing guys that are, going to have potential NFL futures along the offensive line. I don't know how many of those players he's seen yet. But again, I also come back to the idea that, like, it's not those guys you have to beat to have a super successful season at Indiana, even relative to where this program is now compared to where it was at the beginning of the year.
And one point about Kamara that I think he also agreed with, because I asked him about CJ West, and West has been kind of slow to come along, whether it was getting in a little better shape, whether it was kind of learning the ins and outs of the playbook. I think it was a little of both. You saw him flash on Saturday, and at his size, the first sack he had, I rewatched it, was a double team that he just made it as if neither guy was there. And if he plays like that going forward, I mean, gives them 40 snaps a game like that, I mean, that's, that means that this defensive line hasn't really reached his peak, because, there was a point where we thought he could be the most impactful player up there just because of his size and his pass rush ability. And he hasn't really shown that yet. And against Maryland, he did. He got there at times. And if he kind of gets to another level, keeps improving, Kamara's only going to get more. I think he said, look, that's going to help me eat. And so I think that's impressive about this
barbecue, because we don't have enough good barbecue.
Not barbecue in Bloomington.
The thing is, if you're listening and you like smoking jacks, so you like smoke works, just understand there's no such thing as too much good barbecue. We can always have more good barbecue. It's one of those things where your cup never truly runneth over. I feel sometimes like I'm almost just lecturing when I say stuff like this, but you can just reduce it to a math problem. If you can create pressure and penetration and havoc with 4 against 5, and then you obviously factor in that, I would say more of the Big Ten's quarterbacks than not aren't going to be that mobile in terms of like really truly dual threat, not just like, if the whole wide side of the field's open, they'll tuck it and run, but like design runs, danger getting to the second or third level. If you're winning 4 on 5 the way Indiana is with the combinations it's getting on that defensive line, and you don't have to account for the quarterback as a genuine like dual threat danger, that means you're playing 7 on 5 everywhere else on defense. And, for example, we wondered what Indiana would look like from a secondary perspective against Maryland. And I know it's colored a little bit by the fact that Ty Felton goes out injured in the first half of that game, doesn't come back. That is part of it. But even if you say Billy Edwards had a decent day, number one, it was not anywhere near what Curtis Rourke did. Number two, it's not, he was worse against Indiana, the interception notwithstanding, than he was against Michigan State, the other Big Ten team Maryland's played so far this season. And let's also be pretty fair to Indiana. Maryland got 50, 60 yards on some what you would call very low percentage catches, some deflected balls. The one where was his name Billy Knotts, like the right butt cheek hit inbounds before the left butt cheek hit out of bounds. Caden Prather made a couple of just really good, like they were good catches, but they're low percentage catches. The point is, I think you said something like this in the post-game podcast Saturday, that it was almost like Maryland was having to just like pray for miracles to hang in, and Indiana was making all these mistakes and still just kind of constantly putting Maryland in the rear view. When you have a defense that can tilt that math problem in its favor as consistently as Indiana can, like this is kind of what you get. If you can get to a place where you feel like you can bottle up the run with 4 against 5, or maybe if you bring a linebacker, if they have a tight end, and 5 against 6, then that means you're going to have a man advantage somewhere else. And if the quarterback isn't a genuine run threat, you're going to have a 2-man advantage somewhere else. And so suddenly you aren't asking defensive backs to make brilliant one-on-one plays. You can offer a little more help. You can shade things in certain ways. And, I looked this up and then completely forgot it. We've talked about Indiana's efficiency on third downs. Indiana is 4th in the conference on opponent third downs. Opponents are converting barely more than 30% of their third downs against Indiana's defense. By comparison, last year, Indiana was decent on opponent third down conversion. They were 7th in the conference, so basically dead middle, and they were converting more than 36%. So that's a 6% decrease in third down conversion rate. And it's not because Indiana's, getting remarkable individual performances, maybe Kamara being the one exception. It's because Indiana is, as a unit, just kind of winning these matchups in places that allow Brian Haynes to be able to scheme a little bit more comfortably against other stuff.
Yeah, we talked about the mobile quarterbacks in the back half. Really only Michigan State and Michigan have got guys that are even a little bit mobile in terms of, you're going to face a lot of guys that are going to be pocket passers. And I think that's to, like you mentioned, kind of Indiana's benefit with the way they're, getting behind the line very consistently. I think that'll make sort of interesting matchups here down the stretch against those teams.
I guess to round this off, we've been going for almost 45 minutes. How have you reset expectations around this team? Because, I picked them to win 8 games, and I think they're still kind of comfortably on course for something like that. So, I don't know if I'm resetting win-loss expectations yet until maybe I see them play in Nebraska and get a sense for what they're like against another bowl team. But, I certainly at least am resetting expectations for, like, what I think they should be doing in the games that I think they'll win. And, to a great extent, expectations in terms of what I think this team can do to teams that don't have a clear talent advantage at several different spots on the field. like an Ohio State is going to. I mean, even at the beginning of the year, I know you and I on our pregame or our preseason podcast both said that we kind of wrote off Michigan and Ohio State as likely losses. I'm not prepared to say Michigan's a likely loss anymore. I would predict them to lose it because it's still Michigan, but I wouldn't say it's. I mean, it almost felt like the cost of doing business before the season started. That is not the case anymore.
Well, yeah, and having a quarterback that's sort of now they've changed quarterbacks, and I don't think have as good of a situation as Indiana had in terms of a veteran single guy that can handle all those high pressure situations. I don't know how much we reset because I think we were higher on this team than most outside of Bloomington in terms of like media perception. That I assumed they were a bowl team. Like my bold prediction wasn't that they were going to make a bowl; it was that they were going to win a bowl game, and that put them, I think, probably 8-9 wins. And so I think now you're looking at 9-10, but with a much higher ceiling. And what does that Ohio State game look like? Look, I'm not saying they're going to go in there and win, but I mean, I think that should not feel like the blowouts of yesteryear where that this team's just going to get run off the field. That I think that would be a real disappointment for Curt Cignetti to see his team just sort of not compete in a situation where, maybe the score's a little bit lopsided, but that this team can score some points and hold its own a little bit. And like I said, I think, 4-2 in the back half is probably pretty doable, unless, you mentioned injuries. Obviously that's an X factor because this team stayed really healthy. The biggest injury they've had since the season started has really been the place kicker.
You see Curt Cignetti knock on wood today. He mentioned injuries and he
did that as coach's show too. He did that as coach's show.
He knocked on a podium that almost certainly isn't made of actual wood.
So now you think he's cursed the team because he didn't find.
Well, just put a pin in this moment, and maybe we come back to it as one of the infamous moments in IU history.
But I mean, 4-2, and I think in that back half, and we'll see what kind of happens.
So you think they could go 10? You're in your mind resetting expectations means they can win 10 games in the regular season.
Well, total. I mean, I guess with saying that, 4-2. I mean, look, they're going to be favored, right? I mean, probably in 4.
Well, they'll be favored in every game they play, except maybe Michigan State and then Michigan and Ohio State. Probably.
I think they'll be favored in that Michigan State if they
think
on the table.
It's in East Lansing. That's the only reason I wonder if they wouldn't be.
And I think we talked about this on Saturday, just in terms of Michigan State could be a beat-up team that week too, in terms of what they have coming up. We've always said, going back to the preseason, that this schedule did all the, as Tom Allen said, we're probably cursing the scheduling gods because the schedule never did him any favors, but it definitely did Cignetti in terms of how it's set up for him. And not to take anything away from their success, but it's just this schedule.
Yeah, I mean, you have to take advantage of it. Like we've seen Indiana teams not take advantage of seemingly kinder schedules in the past. Let me ask you this then: if you are resetting the expectation as at very least, like it's perfectly plausible for you to see them get to 10, do you think they would be in the playoff conversation at that point? Because the trouble that they might have if they can get to double-digit wins is they really might not beat anybody. Like their best win might wind up being somebody like, a top 20 Nebraska or a top 30, top 35.
Well, as you said, it could be only one team with a winning record, essentially. It could be Nebraska could be the only team with the winning record. Now, I think you probably have to be in the playoff discussion. I think you have to get to 11 and beat Michigan or Ohio State, right?
With this schedule, I think you do. Like and it's going to ignite all kinds of whatever, if Indiana shoots the moon and let's acknowledge that is what that would be like that at this
that's
point.
That's at 12%, right? 12% is 11 wins.
I lost it. Let me find it again. Hold on.
But that's what we're saying. I mean, in the slim chance they do, because you look at all these Big Ten schedules, most of the teams, they have another one of those big names: Oregon, Penn State, USC. Indiana doesn't, and that's to their detriment when you do get into playoff talk, that they just didn't have that sort of quality extra win on their schedule. Look, Western Illinois did get a win though. The losing over. Yes, they won against McKendree, 49-32.
I'm not convinced that that's a real team, but
But when you're in the playoff discussion, you can't hold Western Illinois up as an example of a quality win. That's unfortunate.
Well, but any little bit helps. Any little bit helps. We'll leave it there for now. Again, I do think we'll pull something together much more basketball focused from Media Day, men's and women's. I think is the plan right now. Late in the week, but we did want to recap the Maryland game beyond just the post-game podcast. We will both obviously be at Northwestern on Saturday night in everybody's favorite pop-up stadium for a game that could be, Indiana's only had one 6-0 start in program history, 1967. So that's what we're talking about. That is the
bowl eligibility. You can't short them.
Rose Bowl. That's the year they went to the Rose Bowl. They went to the Rose Bowl that year. They went to the Rose Bowl this year. That's you can kind of see where you can see all the parallels. We will leave it there for now. He's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. This has been Mind Your Banners. Thank you so much for listening, and we will talk to you soon. Go Braves.